Well, again, thank you all for joining. It is 8:01. In the interest of time, I'm going to get started so that we can take full advantage of our wonderful panel today. I am Paige Cottingham Streeter. I'm the Secretary General of CULCON, which stands for the Conference for Cultural and Educational Interchange. We are a binational advisory panel, and we will be celebrating our 60th anniversary this spring. 60 years of supporting and promoting bilateral US-Japan educational and cultural exchange. Our chair in the United States is Dr. Sheila Smith. Our Japan chair is Ambassador Ryozo Kato. Together, the two panels meet every other year in a plenary session to address topics that are important to the underpinnings of the US-Japan relationship, and that's in the people-to-people exchange. And how fitting is it on this eve of the first in-person summit with Prime Minister Suga and President Biden that we gather today to examine and look at the long and important and topical and timely topic of student mobility between Japan and the United States. As a binational advisory panel, CULCON works in working groups, and we have today representatives of the US and Japan chairs of our Education Review Committee. Dr. Len Schappa represents the United States panel, and Professor Egawa was representing the Japan panel. Both have been really wonderful leaders, bringing together a committee of practitioners, of scholars, government representatives to look at a critical topic that is the future of the US-Japan relationship and how do we nurture and support that next generation. So I want to do a quick housekeeping item to first ask if you would mute yourselves so that we could have clear audio to the extent possible without disruption. I'll also suggest that you put your cameras on if you can, so we feel as though we're in the room with our community. CULCON likes to be a convener of those of us in the US-Japan community, whether academia or exchange organizations and others. So it's lovely to see all of your faces, and my screen is filled with your tiles. So thank you for joining us this evening and making yourself known. We will have an opportunity for some discussion with Q&A. And at that point in the program, I'll ask if you use the raise hand feature. I'll do my best to recognize you, but because there are so many of you, it would be really challenging for me to identify everybody whose hand is physically raised. If you're having trouble with the raise hand feature, maybe you can put your question in the chat and I'll try to find it and we can address it that way as well. I also note that we can use the speaker function if you'd like to be able to see more clearly the person who's making the presentation at the time. We will have 4 speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Schappa, then we'll be hearing from Professor Egawa, followed by Professor Hiroshi Ota from Hitotsubashi University, and then finally Susan Schmidt from the Association of Japanese Teachers and the Bridging Clearinghouse will speak as well. Both of our discussants will be reacting to the report of the Education Review Committee, but also giving us a little bit of their insight from where they sit promoting student mobility. So with that, I'm going to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for your attention. And before I do turn the rest of the program over to our panelists, I do want to thank the committee members in Japan and the US who've dedicated more than 6 years to this subject. I want to thank the Japan Secretariat, who has been instrumental and critical to organize the meetings and make sure we had all the information and the materials from the government and other institutions. And I want to thank my colleague Pamela Fields, who's the Deputy Secretary General for CULCON, who has single-handedly managed all of the various moving parts. So thank you so much. And we will be sharing the report in the chat so that you'll be able to have the electronic version for your further review. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Schappa. Thank you so much, Len.
Thank you. Pamela, I guess you can go ahead and put up a few of those slides. We'll put this into historical context here at the beginning. It's really great to be with all of you and talk about something I know everyone here is passionate about, and that is the educational exchange between the United States and Japan. CULCON for 60 years has had grassroots exchange as an important part of its mission, and it has put, in particular, emphasis on educational exchange. You can go ahead to that next slide. So about a decade ago, the members of CULCON at that time began to notice some trend lines that were concerning to them. The number of students coming from Japan to the United States seemed to be in a pretty sharp decline. We'll look at those numbers in a second. And although the United States numbers were going up, they were still well below the numbers of Japanese students coming to the United States. And around 2011, we saw a sudden drop because of the effects of the triple disaster and the number of programs that had to be interrupted or canceled as a result of that. So this was the circumstances that led CULCON to recommit to trying to increase student exchange. And they came up with the idea of forming a task force, the educational task force that would look closely at this issue, try to figure out why the numbers were not rising more, and recommend some specific steps to achieve a very ambitious goal. They set the goal of doubling the number of US and Japanese students studying in each other's country by 2020. And with great networking, they were able to get the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Abe, as well as President Obama to commit to this doubling goal, to make it really a top-level priority of our two governments, speaking on behalf of the broader communities of educational institutions who are involved in this enterprise. So the committee that I'm a part of, the Educational Exchange Review Committee, or ERC, followed up on that ETF report and has spent the last 6+ years monitoring the progress that we're making, checking up on what kind of steps are being taken to grow these numbers, and nudging people where it's helpful to try to get as much action as we can. We finally, we met in Hawaii in 2016, and in the last year or so, it seems like we've been working on it. For about a year, we finished writing up our final report with some of the things that we're going to summarize in a minute. We're happy to report that this document was shared just last week with Prime Minister Abe and then with Prime Minister Suga right before his visit to the White House, which is happening tomorrow. So very timely to have this issue that's very important to us in front of both governments again at this target date that we were looking at. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so here you can see the trend line that concerned the CULCON a decade ago. The numbers provided by Open Doors, which collects data from US institutions and knows how many Japanese are coming to study for credit at American institutions. That data showed that the number of Japanese coming was declining steeply in the first part of the 2000s. And you could see why there was an urgency to do something to reverse that trend. On the blue line shows the trend for the United States. You can see those numbers well below those for Japanese students. And you can see the dip in 2011 that added additional urgency to try to grow the numbers on the US side. So the ETF report used 2012 as a baseline and said, we're going to double those 2012 numbers. Now you can see here that in measured by Open Doors, the numbers on the Japanese side did not double, but you can see a sharp change in the trend line from sharply declining to a virtually horizontal line in the period since. And I think that horizontal line was achieved despite the fact that the number of 18-year-olds, college-age students in Japan has continued to decline because of demographic trends. So we see a growing proportion of Japanese college students studying abroad in this way. And you can see on the American side, the numbers have gone up as well. And you can see that they've increased by 60% since 2012. Now we're going to look a little more closely at the numbers on each side. Okay, sorry about that. This is other data that we have on Japanese students studying in the United States. We were able to learn a lot more through our ERC about the different ways that different organizations measure student mobility. And we realized that a lot of the Japanese students coming to the United States were not being captured by the open doors numbers. This was true especially if they were coming on Japanese faculty-led trips and they were earning credit back home in Japan, but not earning credit at a US institution. It was also true if they were coming here to do intensive English language study in a non-credit bearing program. And those were large groups of students even before our effort. And what you can see is that in the last 6+ years, the numbers in these categories have gone up dramatically for Japanese students. A 65% increase in the numbers studying in the United States for academic credit back in Japan, and a 178% increase in students participating in those short-term programs. So one thing we also discovered through this process, you'll hear about more from Professor Egawa, is that the types of programs that seem to be growing the most and attracting the most Japanese interest are often these short-term programs that are very connected to their home institutions. And so our committee did not try to go against those trends, but embrace them and realize this was a way to get more Japanese students to the United States for their first visit. And this would open the gate or open the door to a lot more students coming in the future. But even in the most traditional category of Japanese students coming to the US to study for over a year or more, so these are in many cases students studying for 4-year degree programs or graduate degrees, you can see a 95% increase in those numbers. Even though they're smaller, we got a very large increase, very close to doubling. And the last slide for me, this is a closer look at the numbers for US students studying in Japan. You see the earlier number I mentioned, 60% increase in the open doors numbers. We were able to collect a lot more data about short-term study abroad on the American side as well. And we can see that the sharpest increase among American students is also taking place with these short-term programs, a 407% increase since 2012. And you can see finally the increase in students enrolled in Japanese language institutes in Japan, 133% increase. All of these numbers are in the report if you want to see more, and there's a whole appendix with additional data, but I'm sure you're waiting now to hear from Professor Egawa to hear more about the principles and steps that we took to try to get these kinds of increases. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Len. Professor Egawa, you'll need to unmute yourself. Perfect.
Thank you, Len and Paige. Now, I'd like to discuss the important trends in the student mobility. In recent years, we have seen the paradigm shift or large societal change, including the permeation of information technology, accelerating globalization, and increasing economic disparity. Those developments inevitably influence student mobility. The good news is that both universities and students have embraced the value of international experiences. Universities today offer various programs to nurture the global citizens. As a result, students today have more diverse options, including short-term programs. Also, the behavior and expectations of those students have changed, unlike the time when we studied overseas during 80s and 90s. Going abroad is not an adventure. Students today expect more hand-holding. They are always connected with their friends and family members through internet. Overall, as Len explained, student mobility between US and Japan has steadily increased. Therefore, seeds have been sown thanks to the efforts of all the parties in both countries. Next slide, please. What are the obstacles for universities? What are the obstacles for Japanese students studying abroad? This is the question we asked overseas. We asked ourselves when ERC started. Through various surveys and research, we found that the biggest reasons are lack of financial resources and insufficient English language skills. Therefore, next slide, please. Universities and governments in both countries began initiatives to address those problems. First, I will explain initiatives to support Japanese students studying in the US. Tobitate Ryugak Japan is a scholarship program based on public-private partnership, which started in 2013, with 12 billion yen donated by 246 firms. 8,000 students received scholarships by 2019, and many of them went to US universities. Many scholarships were launched to encourage student mobility, including Tomodachi Initiative, which is a very successful example. To improve the English language skills of Japanese students, Japanese government undertook English language education reform, focusing on 4 skills, with reference to common European framework of reference for languages. Collaborative Online International Learning, or COIL, is a virtual exchange program to promote international study. Next slide, please. Now, I'll discuss initiatives to support US students studying in Japan. US government initiated Team Up campaign to promote partnerships between smaller regional universities in US and Japan. In 2014, Japanese government revised the Articles of Standards for the establishment of universities to allow Japanese universities to confer joint degrees with partner universities. Japanese universities are increasing the number of classes and courses taught in foreign languages, mostly in English. And internships. The American Chamber of Commerce Japan, among others, successfully implemented internship programs for American students to spend time in Japan. Next slide. I will address challenges for student mobility. First, we need to make US-Japan study abroad attractive to students. In terms of the number of students studying in the United States, Japan ranked number 8, trailing Taiwan and Korea. Similarly, in terms of number of students studying in Japan, US ranked number 13 in 2019, down from number 10 4 years earlier. Relatively speaking, both US and Japan are losing international students to other countries. Another challenge is lack of financial resources. Academic institutions need to develop infrastructure to accommodate international students and prepare relevant courses. We also need to provide scholarships to students. Next slide. In conclusion, student mobility between US and Japan have increased steadily since 2012. In particular, we have seen strong growth in short-term programs. We should encourage those students to engage in longer-term study of a year-long study or year-long study abroad or degree programs. Although the seeds have been sown, we recognize the challenges remain. We need to continue efforts to enhance student mobility to develop the next generation of stewards of US-Japan relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Egawa, and thank you, Len, and really thanks to all the committee members. You all did a lot to collect the information, to analyze it, and as I mentioned earlier, the governments really did invest in ways to help us to realize some significant progress. And I'm hoping that that progress can continue, and it will, with the help and support of our practitioners like Hiroshi Ota and Susan Schmidt. So Ota Sensei, may I ask you to offer your reactions and share opportunities that you see? You'll need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. So can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So my short presentation is the prospects for educational exchange in the post-COVID-19 era from Japanese perspective. So just quickly, I want to kind of tell the trends of study abroad in Japan. As two previous presenters say that the trend is shifting from long-term study abroad for degree to short-term study abroad for credit. So in Japan, the international educators say study abroad is becoming shorter, closer, and cheaper. So, and the short-term study abroad was at the same time spreading short-term study abroad, diversifying study abroad destination, particularly Asian countries. So still, long-term study abroad degree, US share is high. 1/3 of the students chose US to study abroad for degree, but the short-term is 70%. So you see more Japanese students study also neighboring countries. Diversifying study abroad programs, study abroad is it's more experience-based. Internship, volunteer work, service learning is also becoming popular. And then participants, high school students are now study abroad, business people, also even retirees. And then as this is to show that how you study abroad, Japanese people study abroad, students study abroad from US side and Japanese side is kind of different view. So we say Japanese students study in the US is an upward trend, but from US side is a data says kind of downward trend. So, and then now we are struggling with COVID-19 issues. The international educator, we are revisiting the meaning of study abroad, recognizing the significance of study abroad or even redefine study abroad. Why? Because international student mobility is still the main focus of international education policy and practice, means we reached for a limited number of students, those selected students or those who can study abroad. But now COVID-19 has amplified the scale and the pace of adopting online learning tools and developing international education programs for remote learning, means becoming more inclusive. Those people who can't study abroad, don't have a means to study abroad, but we can reach out and we can approach. So more international education becoming inclusive. So now questions, how may the practice and the concept of international education change after this intensive period of experiencing large-scale remote learning? It means maybe COVID-19 becoming under control, we may back to the just only study abroad. Then we may don't do the remote learning. So, but I would say those remote learning, distance learning, the new modality of international education, it's not the replaceable things. So study abroad is still there. And then why do students need to go abroad to learn? I want to quote this newly published book, 2019, Asada's book. So this is said, it is the experience of living and adjusting to a new language and the culture that raise one's comparative awareness of the world through the lens of the host country, while nurturing self-discovery and the development of personal values and attitudes. Also, the first one says also international experience of not only being abroad, but being integrating into daily life while studying abroad in the host country. So it means this value, core value of study abroad is not going to change. So it stay there. However, the international education may change. The programs, one program in Japan, international educator among Japanese international educators talking about short-term study abroad has increased an opportunity to change one's life. People often say study abroad is life-changing experience and sense of values and awareness. However, learning outcome is a question. So, and also instead of being a means to an end, it now see the study abroad has turned the means into an end. That is the issue. So study abroad as an end itself may decrease. So this is a typical example of means becoming an end. So I present now 7 scenario or prospects. I don't know which one is going to be correct, but will there be a decline in the experience-oriented, process-oriented short-term study abroad program? Or will demand for long-term learning outcome-oriented study abroad increase? Because as I said, short-term case, short-term study abroad experience itself, the beginning of the student's journey, the learning journey. But the long-term case, people focus on more learning outcome, degree or skills, and then knowledge. So maybe the market will be changed or demand will be changed. Will short-term study abroad become long-term learning combined with distance learning, virtual exchange, COIL, before and after study abroad? It's called blended learning. I think this is a really promising way to promote international education. With short-term study abroad focus on more experience-based learning, such as internship, volunteer work, service learning, field work, rather than language and academic study in a classroom. Maybe I'm giving some contradictory prospects, 1 and 4, but we don't know still. It's too early to say. To what extent is cross-cultural learning possible through online and on-campus education, so-called internationalization at home, without international mobility? I don't know. Can virtual mobility or exchange be a sufficient alternative for acquiring cognitive skills through study abroad? What about non-cognitive skills? Maybe study abroad the future for focusing on non-cognitive skills, nurturing non-cognitive skills. Will the expansion of virtual mobility and exchange make international education without mobility more common for all students? I don't know. I hope those questions goes to the discussion in today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure our audience is relieved to hear you say that while online learning has made study abroad and learning about other cultures more inclusive, it's not a replacement for the physical experience. And for someone who has helped over many years to make physical opportunities available for American students seeking to study in Japan, we'll hear from Susan Schmidt. Susan.
Thank you. To begin with, I'd like to express appreciation to CULCON, the panelists and the staff members for their dedicated work on behalf of educational exchanges and on expanding student mobility between Japan and the US. I want to mention a special achievement of this report. It not only presents a lot of information, but it combines in a coherent way several sets of statistics on student mobility. As someone who has often been frustrated by the different ways that study abroad and international exchanges are defined, and the different ways that data are collected, I'm excited to have this report to help me answer questions about just how many American students are studying in Japan and what kinds of programs they participate in. Another notable thing is the report's recognition that the traditional study abroad model may be outliving its usefulness, and the glimpse that it gives into new forms of educational exchange that are so important, especially at this time, when international travel has been paused for more than a year and innovation is required. I've been working on the US side of this equation, encouraging American students to study in Japan and administering a program of scholarships to help them do that. And from this side, the story is one of steady progress. Almost 25 years ago, when CULCON began an effort to increase the number of students traveling across the Pacific, fewer than 2,000 US students were studying in Japan each year. Now there are almost 9,000 in traditional study abroad programs alone. And over the years, they have come to form a strong human bridge connecting our two countries. The in-person experiences that so many young people describe as life-changing are still the gold standard. But we are clearly in a moment when the meaning of international exchange and student mobility is expanding to include other kinds of experiences. This report describes many of them: internships, both in person and virtual, online courses, collaborative learning projects, and it points to a future in which options for exchange are limited only by our creativity and versatility. There are still financial and bureaucratic barriers, and we need to achieve greater diversity in international education. But the good news is that large numbers of young Americans of all backgrounds continue to be enthusiastic about Japan, its society, and its language and culture. This report documents growth in the numbers of American students studying Japanese at all levels, and a widening of their interests to include translation, cultural studies, and the professional use of language skills. At the college level, Japanese language enrollments have not only held steady, but increased at a time when almost all other foreign language enrollments are declining. At the pre-college level, some world language programs are endangered by budget cuts, but the enthusiasm of young people has enabled our field to thrive at a challenging time. In a pandemic year, Japanese teachers have been heroes, developing new skills, mentoring one another, and supporting their students. But we are facing a shortage of teachers now, as 20th century pioneers in the field begin to retire. The report describes efforts to attract and train a new generation of educators. Programs like JLEAP and ALEX are bringing young teachers from Japan. But a more secure future lies in young Americans becoming language educators in American schools. JET program alumni are teaching in many US high schools today. New programs are being developed, including a new master's program in Japanese language education at Middlebury College, which is launching this year. Our profession is also working to increase its own diversity and to combat in our classrooms the scourge of racism and anti-Asian bias in this country. We hear the word resilience a lot these days, and it is appropriate in this context too. The contribution of teachers, students, community groups, and government agencies to strengthening the US-Japan relationship is well captured in this report, and it is something to celebrate and inspire as we look ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And from where you sit, it's really heartening to know that there is that continued level of interest among Americans to travel to Japan. And you know, we're all using this platform because we're not able to travel. And so I really am looking forward to that day that travel restrictions are lifted and it will be possible for the students who are studying in American classrooms can have that firsthand experience. And let's hope that that day will come soon. I notice on my screen that there are former commissioners, current commissioners, CULCON panelists, those of you involved in language training and exchange programs. And so I welcome all of you and I invite you to pose a question to our distinguished panel, if you would like. Now, we all should be practiced at this point with the raised hand feature, although you may not. And if I recall correctly, you can click on the participants list and there should be, there's a function. Otherwise, please put your question in the chat. I wanna take full advantage of the expertise that we have on this call. So please feel free to put your question in the chat if that's more convenient to you. I'll also try to scroll and look for raised hands and my colleagues will help me as well. Susan Farr. Professor Farr, you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
I did.
Okay.
I'd like to first of all congratulate the committee for its really superb work. And Igawa-san and Lynn Chapa have done a really wonderful job in producing this report. It was a real privilege to be part of that process in 2012, and it's so satisfying to see it come to such successful conclusion, and particularly back in 2012 was about the traditional academic year or one semester study. And now we are looking at a whole array of ways to study abroad. And those are the ones that increasingly are preferred by students. I wonder if we could direct our question though at this unique period we are in history in which we will be doing a kind of reboot or recasting of study abroad and looking particularly at American students going to Japan. I am struck at least for right now, may lose some of its glitter, and there may be an attraction to going to Japan for one semester or a year. Partly this may be because parents will prefer a safe and controlled environment within a university with strict protocols where they feel that their children will be safer. There may be also the feeling that in the past, many students did one summer internship, one summer study abroad, doing language work, and then a third summer to lost time, and they may want a longer period. So this seems to me a possibility, and I'd be interested in what some of you think about this unique period we're now in.
Thank you so much, Professor Farr. And I'm going to see if maybe Len wants to address that question.
Sure. I do know the students are really impatient to get out of their apartments and parents' homes and get even to the classroom. I have started teaching a few in-person classes at the end of this semester and have really enjoyed the new enthusiasm for learning in the classroom, which they really appreciate after being away from it. And I think they're going to have that same attitude towards study abroad. I am concerned that some of the infrastructure that is really essential to making sure students can smoothly go abroad and transfer credit and all the things that they need is in some jeopardy if we go a whole nother year without physical exchange programs. And it much depends on what happens with the virus and vaccinations in both the United States and Japan. But I hope that to the extent that our governments are able, they will, make announcements as soon as possible about, perhaps even in time for the fall, that if you are vaccinated and if you do certain very clear things, you can still study abroad next year. And I'm hoping it's even on the agenda of the meetings that are happening tomorrow, although they will be talking about many other things. We know that a number of people on the call have been involved in making sure these issues are on the radar of our senior officials to see if we can get some progress.
Thank you, Len. We've got several questions coming in, so I'm going to ask Bruce, welcome, to ask his question, and then we've got Jeff Dynam, and there's a question in the chat which I can read. Please, Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Paige. First of all, thanks to everybody for these really great presentations. They were fascinating, and I look forward to reading the report, so please put a link up or a PDF if you have a chance later. I had a question about facts for Professor Ota. Based on one of your charts, it looked like there was a significant disparity between Japanese data and US data on the number of Japanese students in the US. Can you explain that, please?
This is an issue. The Japanese side, we have two study abroad data. The host country's data collected from host country. Another one is a sending country's, sending institution's data. So the JASO's data, basically the data collected from Japanese higher education institution. We count the students who study abroad, including maybe 1 week or 2 weeks. So no visa required. So that we are just counting those students went out. The US side is the opposite. US side is they're collecting data based on visa and their hosting institution collected. But this is the same thing. When we count American students coming to Japan, Japanese side, we count the student based on visa. And then in Japanese case, just data usually snapshot May 1st. So the only. And then US side can count the student went to Japan. Maybe they don't study at Japanese institutions. They study the American base or American institution in Japan. So always those challenge is issue. The challenging issue is there to how to correct, how we can capture the actual student mobility. So it's those numbers. I would say those the presented number is a conservative statistics.
Thank you very much. Got it.
Thank you for that clarification. And we spent many a day trying to parse that out. And before moving to Jeff Dime's question, I did note that there is a question in the chat regarding when will travel resume and be possible. And that is the $64,000 question. And many of us have been in consultation with government representatives in the United States and in Japan. And right now, many of our organizations have program participants who are waiting to be able to go to Japan. We know even the JET participants and the Foreign Ministry's own program isn't able to send them. So I'm afraid that there's no decisive answer, but if there's somebody on this call from the Foreign Ministry, please send me a note in the chat and I'll be more than happy to read out your response. But until then, Jeff, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Dim. I teach at Sacramento State. I'm a professor of history. Several years ago, me and some of my colleagues put together a short-term trip to Masayama, Japan during our winter break. At first, it was no credit, and then about 3 years ago, we shifted it over to credit, and it was just starting to get going when COVID hit, and it's been kind of delayed a bit. I teach at a large state school, and we have various programs to Japan, and I actually have a student who is under the impression she's going in September, so I'm hoping that it will be happening. But many of my students come as transfers from junior college. They're all interested in Japan, and finance is one big roadblock to study in Japan, but the other one is also sort of the school year. Because of the programs available to my students, and because many come in as juniors and they have tight schedules, they can only do a semester here or there, and then the Japanese school year and the programs available to them at Sacramento State, sometimes participating in a program would literally put them a year behind because it's such the school years just don't align. And I didn't read the report, but I don't know if that's something that you have discussed or looked into, or there are some structural issues. Beyond finance, I was wondering if that had been addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. There are some structural issues, and the academic calendar is one, as is the hiring practice by Japanese businesses. I note that our CULCON panelist, Dr. Patricia McLaughlin, has put a question in the chat related to that. And so I'm going to put Egawa Sensei on the spot and ask if maybe she can address those. You've heard Jeffrey Dim's question, but Dr. McLaughlin is also asking about hearing about the thinking about the business community's hiring schedules, the lack of congruence between Japanese, US, European academic calendar, et cetera.
Thank you for the question. The changing the academic calendar to start the academic year in autumn is something ETF report recommended. So some of you may remember that some of the universities, including University of Tokyo, where I was executive vice president at the time, studied seriously about switching the academic calendar. And we are talking to several other major universities who share the similar vision. Unfortunately, because many reasons, especially hiring practices and also the timing of the national examination to become lawyers and medical doctors and so forth, the timing of those things have not been changed. So as a result, we gave up the idea of changing the academic calendar to shift the start to autumn. But instead, many universities decided to basically cut the semester in half. So many universities in Japan now have 4 short terms consisting the academic year, which means that the students can actually can come to 2 months and then earn a credit. And that actually added more flexibility to both sending outward mobility, both inward mobility for Japanese universities. So that's one. And you may also recall that during the COVID, actually there was a delay in classes. There were some discussions about this change the academic calendar. So I realized there's a lot of kind of potential demand to revisit this subject in the future. Regarding the hiring practices, many Japanese companies began to shift to sort of rather than just hiring many students in mass in April, many companies began to hire throughout the year. The pattern is still a bit sporadic. So there are still many companies which hire large number in April, but I see clear trend of diversifying the hiring seasons. And I think the trend is a positive. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights. I'm going to direct the next question or combine a question and a comment to Susan Schmidt. Susan, in your remarks, you referenced issues of inclusion, but you also talked about concerns about anti-Asian violence and hate. And there was a question in the chat about whether or not that this trend of the increases of violence against Asians in the United States might serve as a deterrent. I'm also wondering if you could address a comment about the high cost of higher education in the United States. You talked about the opportunity, for inclusion, but for foreign and international students, that could really be a challenge. So would you please address those two issues? Thank you.
Yes. For anti-Asian bias and crimes and all the other things that you all, I know, have been reading about, hearing about, I think it is a concern. It's a concern for all of us. And it may very well be a deterrent to students from Asia coming to the US. It's a deterrent for Asian Americans who are often afraid these days. It's a scary time, and I, of course, have no answers, but I think it's something that all of us have to really think about and try to address and work on in whatever way we are able to from where we stand. The high cost, yes, it's a concern, and I know that students, many international students who are interested in going to English-speaking countries are looking elsewhere. We see that trend in the statistics, the overall statistics on international student mobility. The students are choosing to go elsewhere for different reasons, and high cost is definitely one of them. I think partly as a result of CULCON's efforts, over the past several decades, there have been new sources of financial aid and scholarships for American students studying abroad. Similar resources are really needed on the other side to help Japanese students who want to study in the United States to be able to do that. There are some new programs that are described in the report. Their scale is not very large. On the US side, many of you know about Gilman scholarships and other very large numbers that are helping large numbers of students. Many of those are sponsored by the US State Department. And if the Japan side were able to marshal similar resources that would help students wanting to study abroad, it would really be a great thing.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to, there's a note about the opportunity for internships and service learning. And I'm wondering, Len, I know you've been involved in faculty-led exchanges, and that's something that has proven to be a way to capture the interest of students. Among your students or in your field, do you see growth areas of opportunity through either service or internships?
Certainly, I know that Daniel Snyder from our group, or David Snyder from our group, spent a lot of time working with the ACCJ committee that really dedicated itself to publicizing the kinds of internships that American students would benefit from in Japan, and making those opportunities connected to study abroad. There's a lot of room for that to grow, because it's becoming increasingly the case among our students that they expect to do an internship of a month or two in a summer before their junior or senior year. It's such an expectation that 1 year of COVID shutdowns seems to have caused a lot of anxiety, because during that period it was hard to get a regular internship. So I think that trend is only going to grow, and it will be important for programs that want to encourage American students to go to Japan to develop more opportunities there. And I think that the word is getting out in Japan too, that internships can be more than just a brief encounter where you meet people, but they can be an opportunity to get some work experience and really try out what it's like to be in a corporate environment. And as that model of internships grows, there ought to be a lot of opportunities on the American side to introduce Japanese students to opportunities to work in the United States in that way, connected to their internships. And there's a whole lot more we could do of this type. You know, Australia does a much more effective job than the Americans do in connecting study abroad to future work opportunities in Australia. And so if the Americans really want to make compete in this study abroad space, we have a lot more we could do of that type.
Thank you so much, Len. I realize there are a couple of people who are waiting with hands up. Danielle Rochelo Salas, and then Shingo Ashizawa, and then maybe we'll hear some final comments from our panelists.
Okay, I want to first thank you guys. I think after a year plus of all kinds of bad news just everywhere, it's really, I don't know, refreshing and heartening to hear some good news. I actually unexpectedly teared up while Susan was talking about sort of the progress that has been made. And so, so thank you. And this is an exciting report that I look forward to reading. My question is, as someone who started out with a short-term exchange, I went to Japan for 6 weeks in high school, and 30 years later, I'm still doing this for a career. You know, I have the frustration sometimes that I think short-term exchange is shortchanged, right? That there's this sense that it doesn't count if it's not long-term. And so my question is whether the report has data about students who have had short-term exchanges that then were converted into longer-term exchanges, and sort of what that progression might look like. You know, 6 weeks in Japan is not sufficient, but you know, people can go back and do additional things later. And I think that those short-term exchanges can be a really good way of you know, starting that process. And so I'm just curious if there is data about sort of how often that happens.
Thank you for that question. And we spent a good year or so talking about short-term exchange, and we recognize that the reality is there's now a pipeline, and short-term exchange can whet the appetite of the student to have a deeper experience. Egawa Sensei, do you have anything that you'd like to add on this topic?
Sure. The fact that the many students who spent short term in US or Japan will go back for longer study is the exact reason we incorporated those data for short term experiences into our report. Unfortunately, we don't have a solid data how much of those short term experiences converted into long term. Anecdotally, we know many students who have done that. So this is something we need to work on. And I'm sure it's the same in both directions.
Thank you. Shingo Ashizawa, I see you have a hand, but I don't see your tile. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I like to show my agreement with the speakers, all the speakers, and particularly I like to mention three things. One is virtual learning could be a good alternative program after COVID-19. So this is definitely low risk and low cost for all the students. And secondly, non-traditional learning is also key, including internship and the field trip. And also finally, I like to emphasize that we should utilize more existing resources rather than creating a new platform or anything. So we have a good number of third-party or multilateral consortia like ICEP or UMAP, and also we have a good serving third-party organization like a Study Abroad Foundation. So we should utilize. Also, I like to mention that the Sister City program supported by a local government, those things can be utilized more. I think that's I think key. Resource sharing. For instance, I sent students to Washington Center internship program every year. Also, we conduct a field trip to Los Angeles supported by local community people visiting Japanese American historical sites. And I feel glad or fortunate to receive recently support for the U.S.-Japan Council by U.S.-Japan Council to do his storytelling program. The Japanese American people give us a specific talk to our freshman students. So that type of like a resource sharing model would be a good for our students. So I like to make some kind of a platform disseminating those existing resources function.
Sorry to cut you short, but that's a great point. And in the report, you'll see there's a robust appendix section that does list and include a number of different initiatives. And one of the reasons why we like to have these kinds of community conversations, because you are the community, you are the people who are going to help advance this work. And so I'm glad to hear what you've been doing, Shingo. I want to hear more about what other organizations on this call are doing. I know the Bridging Foundation is represented, and companies like Amway offering internships is represented, and Fulbright, and so many of you are already doing great things that we should learn about and replicate as best practices. So please absolutely do stay in touch with CULCON. My colleague Misako Ito is on the call representing the Japan Secretariat, and I'm sure that she would also be welcome to hear from all of you about the great work that you're doing, whether it's in Japan or the United States, because the report has been published, but the work is not done. And it will be important that we continue with the momentum and continue building the spotlight and making the investment and all of our resources are limited. And so we do need to make the best of what we have. So I'm just going to, recognizing that we are at the top of the hour, ask our panelists to offer in 3 words what you would like to have this community do to advance this important work. Okay, 3 words. And I'm sorry I gave you no warning. They didn't know I was going to ask this, but I'll let you start, Len, and be our role model.
Go to Japan.
Got it. No argument there. Egawa Sensei, 3 words.
Come to Japan.
Okay, I like it.
Right? Because I actually want to explain the American government has so much emphasis on bringing students from Japan to the US, but America has 3 times population than Japan. So there's much more upside for students, US students coming to Japan. And we need to offer resources so that there are many fans of Japanese pop culture in the US.
Absolutely
so we can bring
right.
them here.
And Ota Sensei, 3 words.
Oh, I can't do the 3 words, but I would say just connected to the Daniel's question. Short-term study abroad, but we can be a longer-term learning with virtual learning, virtual exchange. So that is a key to bring the short-term study abroad to the longer-term connection or maintain the interest in the study abroad. Mm-hmm.
Love it. And Susan, can you meet the challenge?
Keep the faith.
That's a great note to end on. I can't tell you how heartwarming it is to see all of you, members of the Japan and US Education Review Committee. Thank you so very much. Japan Secretariat colleagues, US colleagues, and all of you in the community. Stay tuned. There's more work to do, and I look forward to seeing you either in Japan or the United States. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.